Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's rule-abiding games, and what I'm calling the art of the fair fight. Vague thoughts, EyePatchNotes asks, on rule-abiding games, by which you mean, I tend to find myself latching onto games where a rival or boss character uses the same mechanics that the player does, that is, the opponent abides by the same rules. This would only apply to specific kinds of games, whether turn-based or Souls-like. However, there's a certain level of enjoyment derived from, oh, I know that move, or this enemy is using my strategy against me. This partly was made with my experience with AI Limit, a game called AI Limit, in mind. First the demo and then the full release. In a VOD about the subject, you said, AI Limit's now sunsetted, demo, pits the player against the second best or so boss in the game. The main qualifier for me is that she follows the same rules you do. She's a humanoid using weapons and parries like you can, and she has her mana/poise bar under her HP bar, again like you. The player can watch her belt out these flashy attacks and her poise dips. If she hits you, she can cast more of them, etc. A sweaty snippet of AI Limit gameplay is included for reference. Put it in the description, yep. This is the full game and not the demo, but this was the demo poisoner in question. This is the boss you're talking about. Right at the 12-second mark in the demo, the boss enters a parry stance with matching video and audio cues. Note the similarities to the player's own parries, which in this video the player is spamming and blocking almost every attack with, as well as the UI elements. Yep, they're very similar. You can watch that in the description if you'd like. Now, should you be someone who follows Parley a lot, you might notice something. Now, EyePatchNotes Parley are often not open-ended in this way. It's often a structured thing you want to present and then have me bounce off of. This is more of an open-ended prompt, more like some other styles of Parley. Pretty cool. So it'll be fun to stretch my legs and do something like that a little bit. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. So the topic of the Parley is this idea that the idea of it being a sort of fair fight, I'm using in a very particular way here, just to say that the fight is presented as you and the opponent are the same or using the same rules. When this happens in games, it's very common that the opponent is more hardy than the player. The opponent isn't literally equal with the player, but is close to it. And usually that's that they have more HP, but otherwise use similar abilities to the player. And usually that's because they are not controlled by a human, and so they don't move in such a way. But I think it will be useful in this parlay to think of cases where it would be that you're fighting, PvP opponents in a symmetrical way. Symmetrical here meaning like they are building up character with the same things you are. And certainly as somebody who's enjoyed that in many games before, I have a lot of opinions about fighting someone that is on equal footing, especially when the game has a narrow enough ability set provided to the players that you can kind of know everything that they can do, or you can keep track of everything they can do. I, in short, agree. I really, really like this. And I think the reason for me is that it encourages or kind of jumps you to that meta area of thinking. It makes you feel like you understand the game and you can use that information to kind of make decisions about your decision making. You can react to an attack coming, but think about their reaction in the context that, oh, they're using the abilities I do. That big swing that's coming has a cooldown, for example, or costs a lot of mana, or it's got a lot of end lag. After the animation finishes, they're vulnerable for a while, or something like that. Like a fighting game, a 2D brawler fighting game, or Smash or something, like those kinds of games in other genres of game. And you start to plan around that a little bit. Imagine you mentioned turn-based combat, just to keep it abstract for the audience, because we're not talking about specifically in a Souls-like or a fighting game or whatever. Imagine that you were playing a game with turn-based combat, and the boss was an ex-party member that betrayed you. This is a common twist, right? And then they use an attack that because they were literally in your party, they're not only using the same power set you are, you literally use them in gameplay, but then they betrayed you and now you're fighting them. That ability has like a 2-turn cooldown. So they use it, and then you can be a savvy player and go, okay, I can heal up for 1 turn and then go in for damage with a stun, and then I'll interrupt them right before. And I'm not in danger for that first turn when I'm healing up. I'm not in the same amount of danger. There are other ways that you can acquire that feeling. The enemy doesn't have to use the same abilities you do. For example, you can use design knowledge to just kind of intuit when something is happening. You can, I'm playing Chrono Arc right now. Well, I am, but Chrono Trigger, excuse me. I'm playing Chrono Trigger right now. And in Chrono Trigger, there is this boss early on that is a big blobus mutant guy. And as you attack them, every so often they skip the sort of turn order action real time battle system thing that Chrono Trigger is doing. They skip that order and combat pauses while they bounce between your party members and do damage to everyone, seemingly at random. But I did a big burst of damage and then it happened again. And then the next time I did a big burst of damage, it happened again. And I, having played video games before, went, it's probably HP thresholds. You know what I mean? And so when it happened more than 4 times, I went, okay, so it's not 25% every 25% HP, but I bet it is regular amounts of HP, or is it happening more frequently now? Ooh, maybe it happens more frequently toward the end of the boss's HP, which means I'm probably near the end. You can't see health bars by default, and I unequipped the item they give you to see them because I thought it would be interesting to do that. And indeed, when it was happening very frequently, I took a little leap of faith and went, I think I can afford to not heal here and just kill it. And that worked. I was indeed near the end. I'm not sure that that's exactly how it works, but it seems like I was able to intuit it's either every so much HP, perhaps every 12.5% HP. I don't know, it happened around 8 times, maybe, if I had to say. Or maybe it happens more frequently toward the end of the boss's health. It's a little hard to tell. And that was a pretty interesting experience. It created some push and pull, some tension in the gameplay, because I was able to make an assumption, an educated guess about what was happening. I didn't feel like I was going to be totally blown out, and especially if you literally know the enemy's power set instead of just guessing the game design like this, you can, sometimes you get punished for making the educated guess, but it feels kind of fair because there's some parameters around the boss's abilities. Like when bosses do clever or tricky things in Chrono Trigger, it kind of feels like, well, but their abilities are pretty basic, so it's sort of expected that they're going to have some little move. I didn't get alarmed or go, that's cheap, when the boss first, boinged between my characters. I just figured, yeah, okay, I mean, they have some big move, all right, stuff like that. Or if you're fighting an opponent in a PvP video game, and they're using the same powers you do, but you just kind of overlooked or forgot a small thing, and then they get you. It's like you get punished for making assumptions and thinking you knew what they could do, but it kind of feels good because it feels sort of like a fair, like they were clever instead of it being that's like some cheap bullshit happened. I think this can be really cool. I really, really like this topic. So, to explore it, having established that you can do some of the things that are good about it other ways, there are more ways than just like guessing about game design too. Let's start this parlay proper by taking a different approach. What are some bad things about doing this? I think it's really good. EyePatchNotes thinks it's really good. So, I mean, is there any reason not to do this? Again, to be clear, is there any reason to not have the player fight opponents that they have meta knowledge of, like that they can know what is coming from the opponent? There's a few obvious aesthetic-based things. Well, yeah, I mean, if the opponent has to be like the player, that really limits what the opponent can do, right? And there are lots of ways you could create tension, or it would be like interesting or fun to fight a boss or an enemy in a game that doesn't have the capabilities of the player. It could be a bad way to telegraph incoming content. For example, fighting a group of wolves in a role-playing game. Well, it's a good telegraph that this is a basic enemy in the forest, and they can be dangerous when in groups. It's like a starter enemy, but you don't want to underestimate them. That vernacular is pretty good, and you can also telegraph if you want that to be different too. You could just not use wolves, but you could also use wolves and have the game, I don't know, have someone as you leave the village say, hey, the wolves are no joke out there. It's not just like normal wolves or whatever. And you can make the wolf sound or have a name that is magical or whatever if you want to make them sound different. So it doesn't really limit you to have the player fight other things just because the player makes assumptions about them. You can undo that. But indeed, you wouldn't want the player to always fight opponents that were of the same caliber as them. Okay, but let's look at games where you do mostly fight opponents that are of the same rough caliber as you. Let's call these dueling games. Games where a significant or almost all of the gameplay is about a kind of combat dance between you and the opponent. Dark Souls, Monster Hunter Wilds are games that fit the bill in my mind. AI Limit, it seems. These are games where there might be combat that isn't fighting like a boss that has kind of similar or very carefully matched to the player abilities, but that is the bulk of the gameplay. That's like the central showpiece, right? In Dark Souls, or Lies of P, I more recently played, there are enemies that are a threat to you that fight in a way very unlike the abilities you have. But there are also a lot of very hallmark parts of the game that aren't like that. And really, those filler enemies are there more as an attrition thing, or you have to stay on your toes a little bit, not the kind of marquee challenge of the game. So in those games, which I will call dueling games for this parlay, what then? You know, obviously there is a point to fighting enemies that do not fight the way the player does, like ever, sometimes. This, I think, is what you were evoking by saying this would only apply to specific kinds of games, whether turn-based or Souls-like or whatever. But just within those types of games, so what are some reasons not to do this? It sounds pretty good, right? You kind of jump the player to a meta awareness of their opponent, and you really feel like you're interacting with the game on an even of sorts battlefield. Another way you could say this is really cool is that it gives you that awareness like you're a professional, seasoned fighter, a mercenary that's out in the world, and you're used to sizing up your opponent and getting a feel for their abilities and knowing what you don't know as well. That's really cool. This seems like a way to speed that up. So why not just do it all the time? Again, you might say, well, there are some kinds of enemy that are interesting to fight where it would be not impossible, but contrived to have them use attacks the way the player does. For example, in Monster Hunter, you fight monsters. It's not immediately obvious how the monsters could be using a heavy bowgun instead of like their fangs and, you know, claws and such. Though I would be interested to play a game like that. You know, I mean, I don't immediately know how the monsters in Monster Hunter could easily be using a greatsword like the player to fight the player. But I would play that game if it was on offer. You know what I mean? Like, that actually does sound good. So the question is just what trade-offs do you get for having monsters that fight like a normal monster? You know, it's immersive, sure. Let's focus on benefits for the combat. There's the aesthetic of a kind of underdog. You know, you're fighting this huge monster. In a way, I often feel like you're sort of bullying the monster as a Monster Hunter, though. But anyway, that's a very particular feel of the game. Combat-wise, what are the trade-offs? Well, it does make different kinds of abilities good in different ways. I think this is the first thing. If you have an enemy that unleashes very large, sometimes somewhat indiscriminate attacks, and you, the player, can block, for example, there's something. Monsters in Monster Hunter don't really block as per se, but the player does. And part of the reason is that the monster's attacks are very big. If the monster blocked in any way that was meaningful, imagine if this is silly, but the monster holds up a shield, literally just like a heater shield, a kite shield. How are they going to block the player without the shield magically hovering right where the player is attacking, right? It just doesn't really line up in the same way. And so the monsters have their own kind of fighting mechanics that make sense for them. A favorite of mine is Gravios in Monster Hunter Wilds. This is a monster that is very big and has very heavy plate armor. It's a big chonkster. Gravios is a bit chonky. Gravios will hover a little, has wings, but can't easily fly, and has this very heavy plate mail armor, and also has vents on the underside of its body. It's big, got lots of defenses, and you don't do very good damage to most of its body at first. When you break off armor plates of Gravios, you'll often get these little slinger ammo, little thing for your slingshot, that are explosive plates from its body. I guess it's made of those. I don't know how that works. And you can shoot them at parts of its body to blow off more armor, and you kind of make your own weak points as you go. You kind of already do that in Monster Hunter. That's sort of a thing. You attack different parts of the monster's body to break their tail, or their horns, or their wings, or whatever, to get different loot, potentially to disable attacks that they have. But Gravios takes it a little bit of a step further by causing you to make the parts of the monster that are weak points to an extent. At least I think that is the idea. I think it is only a B plus execution of that idea, but whatever, it's useful as an example here. That's pretty cool. And that dynamic comes from the fact that the player has a different priority from the monster. So certainly there's something interesting about that dynamic too. We're not here to prove that it is bad to have the player fight opponents that use the same abilities as the player, just to think out loud about what the decision is. So what are the benefits of not doing that? One of them is it can create a very specific dynamic. I think that's the crux of it for me though, and why we'll transition to the next part of the parlay. I think it's that if you make the player not fight opponents that have the same dynamic as the player, it seems to me like the primary benefit of doing that is that you can have the player have a very specific combat loop experience. And if you don't have that in mind, and you just want a game where the player enjoys dueling, that, again, dueling in a more broad way, counting things like Monster Hunter as being that dueling gameplay. If you don't have a specific, like, combat dynamic in mind, as in Monster Hunter, maybe it's a good default choice to have the player fight opponents that use the same abilities as the player does. After all, if the player uses the same abilities as their opponents, the developers can just reuse those abilities. So that's very convenient. And the player gets the bonus of kind of feeling like they know the kinds of abilities the enemy would have. I think that's really good. You can even go as far as showing the player the enemy's UI for a moment. I haven't seen a game do this, but I bet a few games have in the past. Show even a cutscene of an enemy doing an attack, and then you see the cooldown or some visual indicator maybe on their character model of a cooldown, and you, the player, go, oh, they have that attack too, but they also have the cooldown of that attack. Huh. And if the game will strictly obey that, and you give the players attacks that have like long enough cooldowns that you notice, the player will pick up pretty quickly, like, oh, the opponent has the same limitations as me. That's kind of cool. The feeling of kind of feeling like you know that the opponent is down, you know, they use their big move, it's time to go in, is great. It really feels like there's this interactive back and forth between you and the opponent. Just to transition to the next section, I could also see someone saying, though, I mean, the developers reusing the abilities from the player, they might not reuse abilities from the player specifically. They might make new attacks that are whatever. So whatever, put that aside. That's not really a critique of the design choice either. That's just saying, oh, some people might have a bias that seems a little lazy or something. But it doesn't actually matter. I mean, it's efficient as long as that's a fun thing for the combat to do, to reuse abilities from the player. And many games that do this don't, right? AI Limit, it looks to me like the opponent is using attacks that are not like specifically available to the player. It's just the same system, or magic system, if you like. But looking at it another way, it's like, okay, yeah, but also the benefit here is that the player gains a meta awareness of their opponent's fighting abilities, like faster. You still get that when fighting works other ways. You just might not get it as quickly. For example, when you play Monster Hunter, you can learn the monster's attacks and like get used to, oh, it's gonna do this when it's up in the air, or, you know, this monster has a lot of ranged attacks or status effects or whatever, has a really good or a really bad tail swipe. If you've played Monster Hunter, Arkfeld's tail attack always gets me somehow, even though it's kind of easy to dodge. I feel like it's a jab, and Zoshia has like a kind of weak tail attack, in my opinion. I think that is one of the like tricks with Zoshia if you're having trouble, is that it's not very strong from behind, especially compared to other monsters in the game. There's even that one Zoshia attack where you have to stack on its butt, and everywhere else gets covered in fire and you take damage. Or more or less. Like you certainly do still gain an awareness of those things. The suggestion here, to be clear, before we move on to the next part, is the idea that having the player fight enemies that have the same abilities as them makes the player get to the point of feeling like they know what is coming, can adapt and plan around it faster than the opponent. Faster than otherwise, faster than other designs. And I think that that's good. I think that feeling is fun. It makes you feel like you're getting to sort of the real combat. In many games, I would argue that the depth that the game possesses doesn't happen until you have that awareness. And this makes you get to that point faster. It seems like a good thing. Wouldn't you agree? Going even further, we have games like Magic the Gathering. I personally think Magic the Gathering is outright bad until you get to that point. It is outright not a good game, not a fun or worthwhile exercise, until you get to the point where you have that kind of awareness of, until it becomes wizard poker, basically. I don't really think Magic is actually good. Magic's design largely serves creating that dynamic, in my opinion, and so Magic the Gathering gameplay that doesn't facilitate that is at least questionable, I guess I'll say. Some people, I heard a metaphor one time where someone said they feel like Magic the Gathering sometimes is like chess, which is one kind of fun, but at other times is like poker, which is a different kind of fun, which I think is an interesting way to say it. That might be Fish on YouTube, Fish NTG, one of the Tiny Leaders Rules Committee people. I don't want to misattribute. I think that's who said that. And I think that's an interesting way to put it. I think it's interesting to think about games where you say, this game is providing a system and rules and controls the player has to get used to. What is the payoff or the goal of those systems? Players tend to not think about it like this. Some players think, well, this game lets me do this big attack. That's just cool. That's why it's in the game. But I think from a game design perspective, it's helpful to say, well, why does the game need that to be in the game to achieve its design goals? And if it doesn't, you could make the game easier to learn without losing its design goal if you removed that thing. So it would be good to do that. Likewise, the fighting an opponent that has the same abilities as you follows that rule very well. If you don't need to achieve your design goals by giving the opponent different abilities, then it helps the player understand what's going on in the game to give them similar abilities. So that is kind of good until proven bad, until it's in the way. That was what I meant earlier by it being a good default way to do it. Many game developers, artists in general, mostly, in my experience, don't do things because they have a principle, logic-driven reason to do them. They do them because they have a creative interest in doing them. Therefore, having a default that is useful or interesting in some way is good, worthwhile, because it means that if you don't have any particular intention with influencing the player a certain way, because you're not like insane like some people and want every single aspect of the game or book or movie or whatever, every single aspect, every pixel on the screen, every word on the page to do some surgical thing to your audience because you're like not insane and recognize your mortality, then you probably would want to have an idea of, if I'm not going to use this element of the narrative or the gameplay, what would be a good thing to do just as like a baseline, like the basic way to do it with no frills. And I think that having the player fight someone with their own abilities is that kind of basic thing in combat. There may be many games that want to not do this for various reasons or not do it all the time, but I do think it is a good default of a sort when you would want to default. But that just gets you to it faster. The other side of this for me is that a lot of the time good game design advice, good artistic advice, indeed, is literally just how do you make it good for most people? How do you make it accessible? A lot of it runs the risk of saying. But I don't think I personally want most people making video games or art in general to make things more accessible only. In other words, like if it was at the expense of depth, for example, people need to be able to, accessible here being very used in a very broad way, not like accessible to people with disabilities or physical difficulties. I'm saying just accessible, like easier to get into. If that comes at the expense of depth, I think that that's bad. Just for an example, in Monster Hunter Wilds, I think it would be difficult in the current state of the game to make the monsters also have attacks like players. And indeed, I can't think of many that do. Most monsters, even monsters more similarly sized to the player, don't fight in a way that is reminiscent of the player. And that's fine. The game doesn't really need them to. But it would be interesting to do that, I think. If you fought like rogue hunters, that would be a different game than Monster Hunter Wilds, but I think that would be interesting. If it limits the player to only fight enemies not like them, that you could say that's bad and reduce the game's potential depth. Likewise, if fighting characters like the player, it causes problems, that's bad. How would it cause problems? Is it true that having the player fight opponents that use abilities like theirs limits the game? Well, it could seem to. I mean, after all, if the game is based on the player being able to assume that their opponents are using attacks like the attacks they have, then when the opponent uses an attack that isn't something the player has access to, or feels like it's not following the rules of what the player has access to, you could risk making it feel very cheap, cheap in a kind of new way than when an enemy does something unexpected but looks different from the player. Because you baited the player into assuming they would know what was coming, but then sort of cheap shotted them and did something that they couldn't have seen coming. You can see how that could be bad, I hope. So, okay, that's a potential concern. Maybe having the opponent fight using the tactics the player uses has the consequence of making it hard to let the enemies use anything the player doesn't have access to, because it sort of sets them up for a cheap shot. That's a very cheatsy way to create difficulty. It would make the player die in a way that would feel surprising in a bad way. They would feel like, oh, well, the game set me up to feel like when I lose, I feel like it was because I was outplayed, but then killed me in a way that was not outplaying me. Like, that feels kind of cheap in a way. Why did you even set me up to feel like I would see what was coming if you were going to then break that rule? It almost feels like the game is trying to cheap shot the player, right? But no, I don't. I'm just thinking through this subject. I think that concern is not actually a huge deal. I think there are lots of things you can do. Let's do an example. So in tabletop role-playing games like D&D, I, as a game master, very frequently have my players fight opponents that are player characters. It's very common advice in tabletop role-playing games to not do that. But that's common advice, as far as I can tell, because the players recommending that are concerned that their game master will get bogged down or slowed down, or they've had that experience. The proof is in the pudding. If you do it and you feel confident that you can run, if things are moving quickly, it's not a problem just because people say they're concerned. It's a problem for reasons, and those reasons could be addressed. My combat runs very fast. Thank you very much. But if yours doesn't, indeed, like that could be an easy way to make it run faster, is to not run as complicated enemies, right? To me, that is not complicated. That's just my perspective. It's a strength of mine as a game master. I have weaknesses as a game master. Running opponents against my players that use the rules the players use for character creation. So what this means, just to clarify, is I have 2 level 3 players, and they will tend to fight humanoid opponents that are level 3 player character rules created NPCs. So, for example, they might fight like a level 3 wizard, and I would restrict that character primarily to the abilities of a level 3 wizard. Right now, my players are fighting I have a pretty high magic setting, so I have somebody who creates spells, and they're a wizard, of course. They're a blade singer wizard, and so they're level 3. They're only allowed to be level 3 at this point in the campaign, if I want them to be an even match with the players. I just find this fun as a game master as well. My player character NPC gets the plan ahead of time, so it's pretty interesting to try to match yourself up against 2 player characters controlled by your players. It's hard, of course. It's 2 against 1, sort of. But D&D's combat is really not made for player versus player combat as is. So it ends up being kind of a Wild West shootout or an advantage-focused exercise where whoever gets their thing off first and cripples the enemy's action economy kind of gets the upper hand. Likewise, everybody fighting is an intelligent, game theory obeying, doesn't want to die, conscious individual, and likely won't fight to the death if there's something they want. In fact, they probably will choose not to fight at all, as long as there's nothing they're immediately needing to gain out of the fight, right? I think it creates interesting dynamics. You can see the problem, though, which is that if those characters get, foreshadowed early and then built up to be villains, by the time my players are level 12 or whatever, it's probably going to be a bit of an issue to not be able to let my NPC do things the players can't. You could say, you can just let the NPC do things the players can't. But as I was discussing before, I do think that comes with the, not deal-breaking, but drawback, that you have kind of made your players think you won't do that on purpose, and then you change that out from under them. That does feel less exciting or a little bit cheap, I think. It's not the end of the world. If you do this, you haven't done some terrible thing. You don't need to be defensive about having done that. It's a normal thing to have done that isn't evil or terrible. But I do think it is not ideal. It would be ideal for the player to kind of feel like they could still rely on that information. But it would be ideal for you as the game master to be able to let your character do other stuff. If you're not familiar with D&D, it's really common for medium plus level opponents or bosses for the player characters to have legendary resistances. A few charges, 3 usually, of the ability to simply shrug off like anything, pretty much, such that the players can have abilities that just paralyze an enemy, because that makes sense in almost every other context. And yet those abilities don't instantly break the game against big boss enemies, like a big dragon, right? You can have an ability that just straight up paralyzes an opponent, but they don't immediately just get paralyzed and cheesed out of existence. They have a little innate resistance to that. This is cinematic. This creates appropriate narrative weight to a larger fight without overcomplicating those mechanics for other parts of the game. You could do it a different way. You could make those stun spells just like not as reliable, and then somehow more reliable against other enemies, and spell save DCs kind of do that if you play D&D. There are other ways you could do it, but this is how they've done it. I want to give my NPC player character, opponent for my players, the ability to resist some stuns, right? So they don't get cheesed like that. But my players can't have legendary resistances. So if they just use a spell on my NPC player character and it doesn't work, and I don't just say it's a legendary resistance, and they go, oh, but then they can just have whatever they want, my players might think, is this an illusion? Like, is this not a player character designed character? I've set them up to think about that. So it would be ideal to have my cake and eat it too. And there's a very simple solution. Magic items. Just have the NPC acquire a powerful magic item, perhaps from a magic item auction that the player characters also attended and saw getting auctioned off to a mysterious buyer who, upon a perception check, they realize they have fought before, and oh no, now they have that ability the next time we find them. But even if you don't do that, they hold up a magic item, or when they resist that stunning spell, a talisman on their neck glows, and the players go, oh, they are a player character still, but they have a magic item that gives them an ability that we don't have. So I can still use the information I had before, but I need to watch out because they have some amount of other magic items giving them other abilities that we don't have. Problem solved, potentially. Now you have to have something that the players know about and can understand in game design language that gives you the ability to do this. You'll note that in D&D, the players also have magic items that give them abilities that their class doesn't allow them to have. So in a way, we're actually just doing the same thing. There's just a more open-ended ability to get abilities. That is very advantageous. One solution then could be to put into your game a very open-ended system of abilities, allowing you to show the player exceptions that they know are exceptions, basically. This allows you to do basically whatever you want with your combat, but retain most of the benefits of the player kind of knowing what's coming, because when there's something coming they wouldn't know about, you have a way to telegraph that. You could even do this in different ways, like in AI Limit, you're fighting this person on the ground, a humanoid anyway, fighting with a sword, much like you, using a parry system and attacks like you, and your poise system like you have. If you want to give them abilities that you wouldn't otherwise have, you could, for example, have a phase 2 where they back up and get into a sort of augmented armor frame, or literally a mecha suit. And then the player sees like, oh, they equipped an item and now they can do something that I can't. It's visually intuitive that I don't have that, and therefore I can't do that thing. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. Have your fight that's like that, and have your cinematic sense of scale. And just the player is not at all unclear about when those things have changed. You could even echo the feeling of the attacks that the opponent had when they were a humanoid, when they're in their mecha, giving the player a little bit of a head start toward understanding what those attacks are, even though they understand they're going to have to adapt in a new way. Lots of games do that. The second phase bulks up, but the attacks are like reminiscent of the attacks in the first phase. Cool. So you can totally do it. I think that the key thing for me is retaining the flexibility to do whatever you want in the fight, while sort of consecrating some of the mechanics to be the thing the player sees coming. or finding a way to, it tutorialize is kind of the wrong word, but to communicate to the player that it would be valuable to, look out for these things and not these other things. I want to talk about PvP for a little bit toward the end of this parlay. What I want to talk about is the idea that cooldowns and stuff, different kinds of combat systems lend themselves to different assumptions that you can make in combat. I find that this is less common in PvE games, but I think it would be cool if it was common. I don't see any obvious reason why, well, maybe we'll find one, it isn't done a lot in PvE games. When you play your Dark Souls, your AI limit in this example, I don't really see why you wouldn't do this, and they kind of do with that poise system. But it would be cool to do it. So let me explain what I mean, and maybe we'll realize why it's not a good idea, or maybe this would be a cool thing to put in a bunch of games. The two iconic experiences for me are World of Warcraft Arenas and Guild Wars 2 PvP, both of which I played to death. I have maybe not played anything as much as I've played both of those things. I definitely haven't played anything that is PvP as much as those things. I've probably played thousands of hours of both World of Warcraft 2-on-2 arenas and ranked 2-on-2 arenas early in the game's lifespan, like 10 plus years ago. Probably longer than that is the last time I played. And then Guild Wars 2, it's 5v5, capture the points, and there's usually 3 points to give you an idea of like what the format is. So the World of Warcraft arena thing, we'll start with that. It's 2v2 and you fight to the death. I believe there's a timer, and if the timer runs out, it's like the team that has the highest combined HP or something. In World of Warcraft 2v2 arenas, most classes in World of Warcraft have a limited amount of resource, mana, and this would be like you have a healer as one of your teammates. Not all 2v2 teams do. It's pretty common to play like a rushdown strategy. Think competitive card game strategies, an aggro strategy, a control or like outlasting the opponent, attrition strategy. You could play a stealthy strategy that waits out the clock and just quickly dings the opponents. That's kind of cheap bullshit, but it's doable. Stuff like that, right? I mean, there are ways to reveal stealth depending on the form of arenas you're playing. And there are rotating maps as well. Sometimes it depends on the map. There's one map that is like a pretty central gladiatorial arena that's very flat, but there are a few pillars. I think the 4 corners, but it's been such a long time, I don't really know. There's one that is sort of more what you'd expect for sort of gymnasium or parkour environment. There's a raised level with ramps leading up to it, and then there's an under part, some raised pillars that you can potentially jump onto, but then get knocked off of. Stuff like that. There are arenas like this, okay? A lot of the time, it was, without communicating in any way, very clear that we are in a war to spend mana the most efficiently. We have a healer and a damage dealer, and they have a healer and a damage dealer. The healer will not be able to sustain their mana indefinitely. It is easy for the damage dealers to safely output enough damage that the healers will be slowly depleting their reserve of mana over time. In World of Warcraft, mana, at least in this part of World of Warcraft, usually recharges very slowly. Like, you are getting mana regen, but it's not quick to get it back. Or the ways to quickly get it back are out of combat, usually. Or a very long, like 10-minute cooldown, way longer than the arena match, right? So you might get to use those once, but not afterward. The feeling of knowing, oh, because they have a priest, and priests are a healing class that they all use mana pretty much, therefore we are going to need to run out their healing abilities. Or they have a paladin, so they could be a healing paladin, and paladins also have an invulnerability bubble. We will very likely not succeed at bursting them down. We have to beat them with attrition. And if we try to burst them down, we'll probably just die because they'll wait for us to use our big damage cooldown, pop the bubble then, causing us to basically waste the damage cooldown, and they get basically all the advantage of the bubble. They can heal up or whatever while we're in that, run away, whatever they want to do. I actually don't remember what paladins are allowed to do in their bubble, but some stuff anyway. And so it was a game of that a little bit. You kind of knew, okay, but those are really long cooldowns designed for raid encounters that are 15-minute fights or using out of combat or in the open world. And so in this arena, they only get that once. But when are they going to use that? Or can we bait that somehow? And can we run them out of mana? And what will be our technique for running them out of mana? Or they have 2 rogues. So anytime they hit us and do damage and then disappear and we heal it up, we've lost a little bit because we spent mana, and rogues don't have a limited resource. They have energy, which recharges very quickly back to full. They have a kind of infinite source of damage that way, and in exchange have some drawbacks. And so you fought it out like that, and that felt really satisfying in kind of a new way. You could kind of see, oh, their mana's low. Are we going to go in? But that's what they wanted you to do, and then they ambush you, having saved up some cooldown or a weird talent they chose to have, something like that. And it was neat. Like, that mutual understanding was kind of cool because they had a resource that got depleted other than health. I think that's the key thing here, and that there were resources available that were not depletable in the same way. There was mana, but there was also energy, which would just refill constantly. But if they went for a big burst move, they would have limited energy for like 10 seconds. You know, it still mattered in some way. There was a different push and pull to the fight. There's also rage. Warriors had a mechanic called rage, which starts empty and fills up as they do damage or attacks that generate rage. They can then spend it to do big attacks, but it can be hard to keep full, right? If you disengage combat or skirmish with a warrior, it might be hard for them to keep their rage up, which could limit their ability to do big attacks. They kind of want to commit, you could say. That's sort of an oversimplification. Like, people who played WoW, believe me, I know. I played thousands of hours of ranked arenas. I know, but I'm just simplifying for this discussion. And I think that's very interesting, having it be that you fight a boss that kind of has one of those resources. You go, okay, so is it going to be this kind of fight? But then sometimes a mana using opponent will, do sustained damage or fire a lifesteal beam that will drain your mana. Warlocks had an ability like that, where they fired a beam that has to physically connect the two of you, but while connected, it siphons mana, not very quickly, but from the opponent. And then you could notice that. You could give that as an ability to the player and then notice it. This also provides a little gentle nudge to respec and make different builds. Whoops, did I turn it into a build systems thing? Anyway, Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 PvP is built around your limited action bar. So there are 10 slots. The first 5 are what weapon you have equipped. So to be clear, this is like a variety of classes can equip a staff. But when an elementalist equips a staff, they get a set 5 abilities that are the elementalist staff abilities. When a guardian equips a staff, they get a set 5 abilities that are the guardian staff abilities. They can't change those. You can swap between 2 weapons, but yeah, there's a kind of set, specific, usually very specific, known set of abilities that you get with their weapon. You can literally just look at your opponent and see, oh, they're wielding a greatsword and they're a warrior. These are the 5 abilities they have on that part. And their cooldowns, usually from least to most cooldown. Then on the second half, they have 1 healing skill, which almost always have like a 25 to 30 second area cooldown between classes. 3 slot skills, they're called. These are like utility cooldowns, again, usually with a moderate cooldown, and then an elite skill, like an ultimate of sorts, again, often with a longer cooldown, but there are variants of these. Some elite skills might be like a summon, and then you probably see the summon out. Or like there's this interesting engineer one where you drop a supply drop that has some heals and a couple of turrets to help support you in control space. But then you see the big crate drop, or you see engineer stuff from a supply crate drop on the ground, and you go, oh, someone doesn't have that cooldown up. Does their team only have 1 engineer? Okay, they don't have that ability. Go. That's pretty strong. Go in on them now. Once it wears off, maybe. And that's a lot of mutual knowledge. You can just see when they do a thing that isn't one of their weapon skills, when anything happens that isn't one of their weapon skills, you can go, okay, so that was one of their 3 slot skill cooldowns, basically, and just start counting them off. And then when they kind of have nothing, you can go in, knowing that they don't have something to break the stun. That's a very common thing in Guild Wars 2. They'll have allocated 1, 2, or maybe even all 3 of their slot skills to be things that break a stun. It just says on the skill if this is something that breaks a stun. And you can kind of bait like that. What kind of sicko would run 3 things that break a stun? But that's what a lot of people do. I mean, it's powerful, but you lose a lot of utility. And you can go from there. That feeling was very, very fun. We didn't get into it too much yet. I would love in the future, when I have more thoughts about it too, to get into the subject of having opponents use the player's strategy literally. So EyePatchNotes, you called out this idea that the enemy is using my strategy against me. I think that you may have meant just like eventually, statistically, if there is a whole game full of enemies using the same systems as the player, you'll probably encounter an opponent that is doing something similar to your build or the player's default playstyle if the game doesn't really have build systems. But going a step further, okay, but like what if enemies start adopting playstyles from the player? Or what if the player needs to keep making builds and enemies are armed with the player's build from a previous iteration? Things like that. I think there are a lot of depths to this area of design. In other words, this is sort of the latter part. You remember in the first part of the parlay, I was focusing on discussing maybe what some of the negatives or limitations of having the player fight opponents using the player's abilities are. But as we went further, I mean, one of the only concerns would be that it limits the depth of the fights that the player will have against their opponent because the opponent needs to be using abilities similar to theirs. But all of those restrictions seem pretty easy to solve, and there's like a lot of other design directions you could go in. I am higher than I started feeling about having the opponent fight you using abilities that you have. Hopefully, this was a fun demo of starting with trying to critique the idea, even though I and EyePatchNotes are both pretty high on it already. All the more reason to start by saying, well, there's surely some bad things about it. What are they? And there are some bad things about it. But I think it turns out that there's a lot of depth here, and it's pretty workable to solve those bad things. I will double down on my statement from before. I think that were you to not be sure like what kind of opponent to fight in a game, and you didn't need to create a specific feeling, it would be a good idea to fight an opponent like you. But really only in games that have that abstract idea of dueling as their design precept. I'm not saying that in Vampire Survivors there should be a bunch of enemies that fire out their own bullet hells. Perhaps not. Though, yeah, it might be interesting to have a few of those, but mostly I don't think so. It would have to be in a certain kind of game, just as you said. I had a lot of fun with this one. Folks, if you'd like your own parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. Post whatever you want. I will say it's a bit greedy of me. It's a lot of fun to get different kinds of parlays from regulars. EyePatchNotes, you've commissioned a lot of parlay, most of which were of a similar format. I was delighted to get one that was also a bit different. I really like the format of the other ones, but it's pretty fun to also get different ones from the same person. So certainly, I know a lot of people listening just have parlay, so I always feel a little more bad than usual for advertising parlay at the end of a parlay. Let me just say, if you already have parlay, may I invite you to feel free to do a parlay that's like a different kind of thing. In many ways, that's sort of easier. I don't know why, for me to do, so you certainly shouldn't feel bad. And you don't have to feel bad if it's going to be a difficult parlay either. I do this to have the mental challenge to some extent. This is a good way to make money, partly because it is an efficient way to turn some of my time and some of your money into entertainment we can both uniquely enjoy, but also I kind of learn a lot from it, or get sort of mental jumping jacks in, is always how I think of it. So I would be very interested in different styles of parlay. And indeed, lots of people doing this for a while have sort of strayed in that direction on their own. You don't have to. I'm also very happy to get sort of an old standby or a long series of similar parlay, and some of you do that. But you're welcome to submit whatever you want. That's all I'm trying to say. Looking forward to the next one.